Okay, and we're live with another episode of The Focal Thought. And my guest today is Dr. Karen Wyatt. How are you, Karen?
I'm great. It's so nice to be with you today.
No, that's awesome. And thank you again for coming on this episode. I'm excited to speak with you. Just a little bit in terms of an introduction. You are a physician who spent, I think, about 25 years in the medical career working with patients in, many challenging settings, such as hospices, nursing homes, and indigent clinics. And you founded a free medical clinic as well in a homeless shelter. And you've started an LLC called Creative Healing, which I want to talk to you about as well, where you're actually matching spirituality into traditional medical practice, and that being in a Western context. And then you're also an author. You turned into a writer after that decision. And your book, Seven Lessons for Living from the Dying. I want to talk to you a little bit about that as well. So welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So you used to be a physician, and in what aspect were you a physician back then?
Well, I was trained initially in family medicine, which is a general practice, seeing people of all ages. And I practiced that for about 3 years. And suddenly my life took a completely different path when my father died by suicide. And I was plunged into this terrible, awful journey of grief and trying to find my way through that. And I ended up at some point along that journey volunteering for hospice. And I discovered that that was really my true calling. That work, working with people at the end of life, was really where I was meant to be. And in some ways, it was my father's death that actually opened my eyes to that so that I could find this entirely new path as a doctor and work with people at the end of life. So I primarily did hospice medicine from then on.
Oh, wow. So his death sort of gave new life to your work in a sense.
Yes, and it really was a catalyst for me shifting to a field that I knew nothing about before he died, before his death. I knew nothing about hospice or end of life care, so I don't think I would have ended up there on my own. So it's just one of those interesting things of life, synchronicities of life, I guess, the way things work out. Sometimes we never know how our path will be shaped or what will influence it. And it was this terrible tragedy that actually brought me to the most meaningful and spiritually deep work that I've ever done.
Sure. And sometimes I wonder, I've said it on other episodes, I wonder if it's just by coincidence or really there's some hidden sort of plan or destiny or, order, you can call it, whatever you want to believe in, that sort of paves the path for us on these personal journeys in our lives.
Yeah, I do wonder about that too, because as I was contemplating, my dad's death, his choice to end his life, I couldn't quite believe that that was destiny for him. I couldn't quite believe that that was meant to be in any way. So that felt very confusing to me, that this tragedy of his life ending led to me kind of finding a new life. And I still have some confusion around it there, but more and more I see that things tend to work out in certain ways that you can't predict and you can't even control. Things just happen, and then you take off on a new path and things work out. And so that's where I'm at right now. I accept that I'm not sure why or how, but things definitely seem to fall in place in certain ways that I was never expecting.
Yes, and I always believe there will always be that little bit of confusion element. As much as we might find meaning or explanation or reasoning, we're human at the end of the day, right? So at some point, there's always a little bit of a guessing factor as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it is around my dad's death that I I allow the most doubt there, simply because it's really hard to lose someone to suicide and then find some pat answer in a way that explains it. I guess that's what I can't do, is I have to leave his death still in that realm of uncertainty. I don't know for sure why. I don't know for sure all the answers about that and what it was about, and may never know that.
Sure. And sometimes that mystery is what makes life interesting, right? If we knew everything about life, then it would be quite a boring life in some sense.
Yeah, it is so true because I have to admit it's all the unexpected things of life. When I look back on it, now I'm old enough, I actually have enough life I can look back on. It's always the unexpected things that have been the most fascinating. Like incredible things happen that I never would have been able to plan for myself. So that leads me to always be curious in a way about, I wonder where this is headed, or I wonder what will happen next. And I find life fascinating in that way.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And death is something, it's one of those taboo subjects. We really don't discuss it in society, especially, parents with their children, or even, among siblings or other family members. Too often it's left till, a person, a loved one actually dies, or you come into an interaction with someone, who has died that you know of in a work setting, or maybe in front of you randomly, on the street. And if we look at sort of the philosophy of death, like Plato was someone who was famous for saying that death is just sort of training for seeking wisdom. And philosophy, his philosophy and his teaching of philosophy was basically training for dying. And a lot of the classical philosophers say that wisdom and happiness will only really happen when you start to contemplate death and cross that bridge in terms of thinking about it, getting past that barrier. And I find that sometimes people, they don't really live their life till sometimes they've thought about death. I've seen some people that they do live a full life, whatever their motivation is, but then sometimes people, it's only once they have thought about death or come into their grasp of their own mortality that they actually start to make best use of their life. And it's something to sort of consider, right, in that regard.
Oh, absolutely. It's so true. And I find that in some ways, I think like, how could we not be aware of death if we look around us? And if you spend any time in nature, like how could you not be aware when you see leaves falling off the tree and you see flowers dying in the garden? How could you not be aware that death is part of life? And yet, when the majority of people in our society, at least here, repress that true fact of life, that death does exist.
So do you think there's a certain age where we should be discussing death with, say, children? Or is it just sort of according to the maturity of the child, maybe?
I definitely think we should discuss it with children, and especially in the natural ways that come up just in living life with little children. Like when my children were 4 and 6, they had goldfish that died, and so we talked about what death was, and we had funerals for their goldfish, and we had a bird that died in our yard, and we talked about that, and we buried the bird. So every time death occurred anywhere around us, we were able to talk about it. And then also my children had a cousin die at a very young age. So they dealt with a human death at that age also, but I didn't want to shield it for them. And given I was a hospice doctor, so I worked with death every day, but I knew it was really important that I just be honest with them, and we talk about it as if this is just normal and natural. So my own kids have grown up without, I mean, I'm sure they have a normal amount of fear around death, but they've grown up without that need to just avoid it or repress it. They are able to talk about it.
Got it, yes. And they did have some exposure as well with you being, working as a physician in the hospice. And it doesn't come to surprise to them like it might to some other children. And I'm reminded of a gentleman named Tim Grover, who was a physiotherapist for famous NBA athletes such as Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. And from the young age of 4 years old, his dad was actually working with cadavers, and he took his 2 young children to work. And he was as young as 4 years old when he went to work with cadavers, and he did that work right up till he was 18. And so, it almost desensitized him to death. And I think because of that, it led him to have a very fulfilling life. And then he also got into, anatomy and physiotherapy as a career. So some exposure to it will take away the shock factor. off death, right?
Yes, definitely. And I also think like what has been true for me is the more every day I acknowledge that life is short and it can end at any time, and it does for people of all ages, then I appreciate every moment so much more because I'm constantly thinking of what can I do in this moment to make sure I'm making the most of the life I have, and I'm feeling grateful for each day and each moment. And so even if it's a day when I'm sick or tired or something isn't going well, I can still stop for a moment and say, however, I'm grateful just to be here. I'm so glad I woke up this morning. And that changes everything about your life when you can constantly bring yourself back to that more positive outlook in every moment, instead of getting too down and too upset about the things that don't go the way you wanted them to.
Correct. Just the gratitude of life and living.
Yes, yes, definitely.
So I wanted to ask you now, you work as a physician in a hospice. And for those of you who might not know, so a hospice is basically a setting where people are diagnosed with a terminal illness, and they've got on average about, 6 months left in their life. And they go to these places for, palliative care and, just to be at peace. And they work with professionals such as yourself. Hospices are something in my research I've seen have been as old as the year 1065. I believe it started in Malta, and then different religions sort of, took them on, and, they've had sort of different faces in society. What is the work of a physician in a hospice?
Well, in the hospice where I worked, we provided home care for patients who were at the end of life. So they were people who had loved ones available to care for them in their own home. So we made home visits to all of our patients, and I was in charge of their overall care. And so making sure that they had everything they needed to be comfortable at the end of life, and managing the nurses and the home health aides. We also had a social worker and a chaplain, and making sure our whole team was working together for the best interest of the patients. So I made medical decisions sometimes about when to change medications or what dose to use. But as a team, we all worked together and all brought our own knowledge and information together so that nothing would be left undone for a patient or their family. And it's really fascinating work because every patient is different and every family is different. And to be able to come and sit in their home with them and hear their stories, and then figure out what could we do that could make this better for them? How might we help them? It's just so rewarding, and it's so sacred in its essence to be able to be part of making someone's dying process a better experience for them, to help them make it be full of love and full of meaning and connection, but also comfort. It's really positive work.
And I like that you said the word sacred, because for someone who's, first entering a hospice, and, they're definitely going to be nervous. The first time they enter that room, I imagine they're stepping into a spiritual setting, right? The energy must be very spiritual.
Yes, and really what I have found is that the people who are attracted to work in hospice are all people who have this spiritual calling, I guess, to be there with patients. So people who are really good at creating a sacred space and being there with patients who are frightened, even with families who are arguing, who have conflict going on. The hospice team are people who can come in and bring this calm spirit into the room and help everyone to just get into a space where they recognize that it's all okay. It's all okay, and this is going to work out somehow, and we're all here working together and helping and making this be a positive experience.
Yes. And in terms of patients, I'm sure you have people who are children all the way to adults and
Mm-hmm.
older people as well.
Yes,
Seniors,
yes, all ages.
all ages. Do you notice a difference between children to adults and to seniors in terms of their mindset, when they come into the hospice?
Well, yes, one thing that was very interesting for me is that young children who were, say, under the age of 10, oftentimes had the most comfort about the fact that they were dying of any other age group. I was very interested. Those children almost seemed to have this wisdom about them, or insight, that they understood that they were going to die, but they were somehow okay with it. I often saw the children comforting their parents and telling their parents, that they had had visions that they were going to some beautiful place. And that amazed me, first of all, that young children
Wow.
seemed to have this wisdom. But there were young people, say in their 20s and 30s, oftentimes felt very cheated and betrayed and had anger because they felt they were losing so much and missing out on so much of life. And so that was a real process to talk with them and about how could you still find meaning in the months that you have left? Like, how could you make the most of the life that you have left? And what would give you the most meaning and satisfaction in the time you have? And then as people get older and older, I found some of the very old patients, they felt a relief in a way of knowing this is how it's going to happen. This is the path I'm on. And many of them felt ready for it. So there were all kinds of reactions. I don't mean to generalize that because, but I'm just giving some examples, but it's so unique for every person and what they've experienced in their life and how they themselves might have been aware through the course of their illness or prepared themselves to be ready for the dying process.
Got it. And then with the children, why do you think they had that attitude? Might it be something attributed to their innocence, or they're not as aware consciously of what's out there in the world as the young adults or the adults might know?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. And some people have said because they're so much closer to their birth, they're closer to the veil, to the other side in a way, if you think in those terms, and that they still have this knowledge that there's love in the universe in a way, I guess. Like they come here, as you said, with this innocent belief in goodness and beauty and love, and that keeps them optimistic in many ways. And it's true, as we go through life, many of us get jaded because we get hurt over and over again and have challenges and difficulties and disappointments. And we no longer feel perhaps that same sense of optimism and joy.
No, I like that because, if you're someone who believes in the soul and, an original spirit, where we come from, the body is just the physical manifestation of the soul. And if you believe that, like you're saying, when you're a child, you're closer to that connection with the soul. As you grow up into a young adult and an adult, when you get lost in the ego, when you get lost in, the particulars of everyday life, and then closer towards when you become older, you're going back into the soul. I think it's very consistent with where you are in that life stage.
Yes, definitely. And I love that you brought up the ego, because I could say that about myself too, that prior to my dad's death, in the way I was practicing medicine, I was trying to be spiritual in my medical practice, and I was trying to bring love into my medical practice, but it came more from my ego and my intellect, my mind, in a sense, than from my heart and my soul. And my dad's death just really shattered all of that. And I almost had to start over again, trying to figure out, who am I? And that's when I really became acquainted with my own soul, I can say, and really understood that there's something so much deeper than I knew, and that love is deeper than I ever knew, and that love can actually be shared through a broken heart, which is what I was carrying after my dad's death. And so his death was this tremendous opportunity for me to kind of accelerate my spiritual growth, really, and become much more guided by my own soul.
Yes, no, and love, I agree with you. Love is something that's very powerful. And for me, unconditional love is God. And, it's something that, creates the universe. I always believe that the universe is creative out of love. And, love will move mountains. It'll, like they say, faith will do it. I think love will do it as well. And, it can really change the paradigm of things. So it's very important that way. And it almost seemed that, your dad, he gave you life when you were born, and then he gave you life, a second life, when he passed away.
Yes, that's so true. And, I went on to do hospice work. And when I wrote the book that you mentioned, the day those books arrived in a box from the publisher, the first words out of my mouth as I opened it up were, "Look what we did, Dad." And that struck, like, why? Oh, why did I say that? And then I realized my dad was my silent partner all along, all through those years of working in hospice and even struggling with my own pain. And then the years it took me to write the book, my dad was there and was part of that. And that he's my co-author, I guess I could say.
Yes, no, definitely. And then with the book, so it's called Seven Lessons for Living from the Dying. The most common lesson we hear of, in articles and in anything we hear of when people are at their deathbed is regret, that they didn't get to do all the things they wanted to in life. And, even love, when you mentioned it just now, I'm thinking of a relative of mine who was, close to his deathbed. I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but, I thought he would be in a mental state of suffering, but all he had to show was love. And, I've told this to my family members that, in his final time, he actually said he loved me, he loved everyone who was around him. And, we think of death being fearful and something to, feel pain with, but people in their, final few moments, they actually feel this love, maybe as they're passing through. And, we've heard of situations where even someone like Steve Jobs in his final days, I think it was recorded, he said something like, wow, wow, as he was passing through. And even Pavlov, the famous researcher with the Pavlov test, he also was sort of, giving his rendition to people on his bedside as to what, the final experience was like, being true to his research, state. And it's not always, fear and pain. So I was wondering if you mind sharing, maybe some of the other lessons, that we normally tend to think, such as love and regret.
Yes. Well, I made the first lesson the lesson of suffering, partly because it occurred to me that for many of us, it is learning how to get through our suffering and not get lost in it that actually starts us on this spiritual journey. And I find that to be true with dying patients too. When they come to terms with their own dying and the fact that they're dying and then move past it, that's when they can get to this state of greater love. So suffering is the first, just that we have to learn how to navigate it and accept that it's part of life. And then love, as you already talked about so eloquently. But along with love, I saw most of my patients working on forgiveness, because it occurred to me, the deeper we love, especially people, the more we will need to forgive, because people are human and everyone that we care for will at some time or another probably hurt us or disappoint us, or we will hurt them. And so we have to learn how to forgive, because that's actually the tool that helps us love people even more deeply. So forgiveness follows from love. And then some of the other lessons have to do with just learning to be in the present moment, because that's also something that we're not very good at in our society. We're either caught up thinking about the past or worrying about the future. And oftentimes people are not even noticing what's around them right now in each and every moment. And I found that many of my dying patients got really good at that, because they understood, I only have a few moments left. I'm paying attention to them. And for me, that was a really powerful lesson.
Correct. Yeah. And, we don't want it to be something where you're always, thinking about death. And because of that, you've got a sad mindset. It's being caught up in the present moment, stepping and separating from your ego. That's important, because like you're saying, we get into interactions with other people. We might get angry at them. We might hold grudges. But then really, if that person were to pass away, these, little politics that we had, they really wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. So we should always sort of, keep that in mind, try to, separate ourselves from what's going on in the present, keep death in mind in sort of in the background, but not let it be, pivotal and prioritize in the frontal lobe that, okay, this person's going to die, right? So I better behave. But, use it almost sort of like a nudge or a gesture, right? Just to say, hey, where is my ego taking me at this point? Is this the correct way to treat this person or go about?
And that's such good advice, because I like the idea. And I would say, after my work in hospice, I don't find that I'm thinking all the time that, uh-oh, I might die someday, I better be careful. Only that having this underlying knowledge of death has sort of changed how I look at everything. So I'm not really thinking about death. I'm just thinking about, oh, like, how can I have more joy or more love right now? And how can I get the best out of this particular time in my life? So it's much more positive than it would sound like to people.
No, definitely no. And what are some of the things you would do after working at a hospice on a regular day when you go home? Not to unwind, but just to sort of, get your mindset into a good frame and not be, bogged down by the work at the hospice and the emotions and things like that.
Well, one thing that I learned right away is that I needed to have my own spiritual self-care practices. So I did yoga. That was always really helpful for me physically, just to get my body into a relaxed state, from the tension or the stress of the day. And then always meditation of various types, sometimes walking meditation, sometimes sitting meditation. And I also journaled, which was really important for me. That's actually how I ended up writing a book, is having kept journals for years and years, and just writing out whatever the emotions of the day were that I needed to sort of process and put on paper. And then once I was done with journaling, I felt like I could leave it there, and then I could be more whole and go back to my other life and the rest of my life with my family and my children.
Oh, that's great. I like because you're doing yoga for the body and journaling for the mind. So, and then, together that'll affect your spirit as well. So that's a really good balance of the two.
Yes, I felt that too. And it felt essential to me that I absolutely had to do those things. They were so important. And so now I still have those practices. I still use them.
Got it. Is there any advice that you can give people at this time? I mean, we're in a world where there's a pandemic, and sometimes you don't get, the 6 months to live. It could be as short as maybe 6 hours or a couple of days. Is there any advice you would give, people who are, sort of in a state of panic, to both the patient and the family members?
Well, one thing that I would say is, wherever you are in your life and whatever is happening, to stop for a moment and think about what is most important to you in your life, and be totally clear about that. And honestly, or perhaps on your last day of life, what will be the most important thing to you? And it's probably not a lot of the things that you spend your time doing. So think about love, think about the relationships in your life. Recognize that those will be the most important things to you at some point when you're reaching the end. And what can you do right now to honor those and to take care of them? And then also, what I've tried to remind people all through COVID is that love is not local. It is not limited to space and time. And so even if you can't be with the people that you love, if they're sick or they're suffering or you're worried about them, you can send them your love. You can be with them in love, and you can give them support, and they can feel you. They will know that you're there with them and that you love them. And so that's been, for me, one of the really important things I've tried to teach people during COVID.
Got it. Yes. And, even if it's one thing that you can do, that could be everything, right? Like if it's one thing that you never got to say to someone, but you tell them at that last moment, that could change the whole world for them, going forward.
Oh, absolutely. It's never too late for any of that healing to take place. And even if you cannot be in the physical presence of a person, if you're able to talk to them by phone or Zoom, you could change everything for them. But even if you can't do that, you can simply write them a letter in your head and send it to them. Just send them this loving energy, and they will feel it. I guarantee you that, because I've seen it happen over and over again.
You know what it reminds me of, I think it was Rumi who said, goodbyes are only for those who love with their eyes, because for those who love with heart and soul, there is no such thing as separation. It's very
Oh,
true what you speak.
yeah, that's beautiful. I love that verse.
Yeah, I know Rumi's amazing. I've yet to study Rumi some more. You can just spend a whole lifetime.
Same here. I'm going to look up that quote because I haven't seen it before. That's beautiful.
Yes. And, finally, I wanted to ask you, so that corporation that you set up, Creative Healing, you did that to merge spirituality into traditional medical practice. And too often it seems that, the Western medicine is separate from spiritual medicine. It'd be nice if it was holistic, and that's okay that it's separate in the sense that each has its, form and function in society, in time and place. And what's happening is here you're actually empowering patients on the one side, with spirituality, and then you're empowering physicians on the other side with spirituality. So I wanted to ask you, you've spoken a bit on, empowering patients. If you can just speak a bit on empowering physicians on the other side.
Well, as I read more and more about physicians these days becoming burned out and really fatigued with their jobs, what I understand is that it's because they have not opened up to the spiritual aspect of medicine in their care for patients. Because when you can connect with patients on all levels holistically, you actually get energized and get fed by that interaction. And when Western medical doctors are limiting themselves to only looking at the physical body, they're missing so much of the beauty and the mystery of people and of health and illness and what's happening around them. And so I feel like doctors are actually starving for deeper interactions with patients that would help them find so much more joy and meaning in their own medical work. And so that's what I feel so much. I hurt for physicians out there. I think COVID has maybe brought it to everyone's attention that something's missing and doctors need something more. And so I'm hoping it ultimately will be a turning point where doctors will open up and be much more accepting of the spiritual aspect of life.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad you brought that unique point up, because you can heal yourself mentally. You can, heal yourself physically. But if you don't heal yourself spiritually, you're always going to be tired.
It's so true. And when one of the biggest problems that faces doctors is feeling that it's a failure if a patient dies. And yet, as we've just been talking about, every patient will die. Like, how could a doctor ever even imagine that their patients will not die, that it's their job to somehow keep patients alive forever? That's the frustrating part for me. If doctors could turn that around and understand, I will do my best. I'll help in every way I can, but every one of my patients someday will die. And I'm just here to interact with them on the journey and help them learn and grow and have the best life they can have. That would free doctors up from all of this guilt that they feel when a patient dies, and all the fact that they feel like they are a failure or they've done something wrong. So that's just a toxic belief system in a way that is always going to be exhausting to those doctors.
No, that's very true. And I'll pull up another Rumi quote here, and he says, "Our death is our wedding with eternity." So there is some sort of happiness at the end of the road.
Yes, I love that as well.
That's great. Thanks again for coming on the episode. It was really an eye-opener conversation, being able to speak with you. And if people want to get a hold of you, or purchase your book, check out your book, some of the writings that you've done, they can come to your website.
Yes, if they go to eoluniversity.com, so that stands for End of Life University, but eoluniversity.com, they'll find there links to my books and my podcast by the same name. Also some courses that I'm offering, and there's a contact form, so they should be able to get in touch with me if they'd like.
Okay, great. And I'll put that up in the show notes as well.
All right. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And thanks again for coming on the show, and I wish you well.
Thank you. You too.